This week we're in chapter 3, so you want to make sure that you go through and read that material, but we'll be talking about various models to program planning, because the question that we start off with when we're considering implementing or developing a program for populations is to um, just have a good sense of, okay, well, where do I begin? So if you were assigned the task, okay, develop a program to improve the health status of this population, where do you start first? And these models can assist you with basically keeping track of what steps need to be completed if there's a particular order. Now, as we go through these, you're going to see a lot of similarities, but you're also going to notice some differences. Some plans are going to have more steps, so there's going to be more considerations that you must take. Others may have fewer steps. They may incorporate all those types of things, or they may just not value them as much as other models and not include them. So let's step through a few examples and just see, and pay attention to where the similarities and the differences are. Okay, the general idea behind using these planning models is to take a consistent and structured approach to developing your health promotion plan. It makes the plan more comprehensive than if you were just to kind of try to figure it out as you go along. Um, each of these models in some way break down when you should be collecting data, analyzing data, interpreting that data, and then ultimately, how does that data contribute to the development of your final plan? So we'll start off with something that we've seen before in this generalized model for program planning. Um, I suppose that you could apply the GMPP to your planning approach, but just recognize that it's a very generic form of a program planning model, and it may not have all the components of the model fully fleshed out compared to some of the other models that we'll discuss. Okay, so again, I've seen this before, and again, it's just highlighting kind of the important things that you need to consider as you plan. So we begin with assessing needs, and that's ultimately something that you want to include. If we come across a model that doesn't have that as part of its formal structure, it's probably going to be implied somewhere, because it's absolutely essential that you identify what needs to be done in order to move this target population forward. So assessing needs, there's a lot that goes into that. It's easy to say, oh, okay, yeah, I'm going to assess the needs, and then we'll base a program off of that. There's a lot that goes into assessing needs. What's your approach? What do you think is interesting? What needs to be measured? How is the instrument you're using collecting data? What type of data? Is it nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio type of data? Um, Depending on the type of data, that's going to guide your statistical analyses. Think back to your statistics classes that you've taken, and you were exposed to parametric and non-parametric statistical analyses. Parametric, it just means that you're working with data that has numerical value, whereas non-parametric, we're mostly dealing with categories, you know, um, questions on a survey instrument that ask you your gender, right? And the response is male, female, or your do you agree with this statement, yes or no, right? Yes or no, that is a nominal type of data, and it's a non-parametric. So you really can't apply your parametric statistical analyses, because parametric statistical analyses relies on being able to calculate a mean. And really the whole point of statistical analyses is to detect group level differences, right? Is one group different, statistically significant difference from another group? So when we're dealing with non-parametric data like male, female, yes and no, there really is no numerical value associated with those responses, right? Female doesn't have a higher value than male. No doesn't have a higher value than yes. So how do we analyze that, and what are we analyzing? So with non-parametric statistics, we still need some type of number to enter into the software. And the numerical number that or the numerical value that we're using is based on frequencies. How many people answered yes? And we're going to compare that to how many people answered no, and we're going to see if there is a significant difference. Non-parametric stats are things like a chi-square, odds ratio, right? They're based on frequencies, whereas parametric statistics, we're analyzing mean scores or averages. And because those themselves have numerical value, we can apply things like t-test, or if we have multiple categories, ANOVAs or MANOVAs, factor analyses, multiple regressions, a much higher level of statistics. So with the generalized model for program planning, saying, hey, look, you need to figure all this out, and then go ahead and assess the needs. And then once we collect those needs, we need to start to think about prioritizing those needs. Ideally, you'd go in and you would address, every issue that exists in the target population. However, reality is that no, we can only do as much as our capabilities as determined by available resources. So some prioritization of issues may be necessary. Okay, the next step in the generalized model for program planning is setting goals and objectives, right? So we always have to identify, okay, what's our final destination? Where do we want to be at the end of this program, right? That's going to be our goal. And then objectives are things that occur within the program that conceptually move you closer. Right? Every time you meet an objective, right, it's analogous to taking a step closer to your final destination. Now, once we have the goal and objectives, now we need to start thinking about, well, how are we going to meet those objectives? For example, you may have a measurable objective that says by 2021 all students on the campus of FAU will increase their physical activity levels by 50%. Right? That's a reasonable objective, but how are you going to meet that objective? What strategies, what activities need to be put into place in order for that objective to be met? That's what we're considering at this step, developing interventions. The next thing we need to think about is implementing interventions, right? So at this point, you've already developed your plan, right? It's on paper. You have all your protocols worked out. You have all your strategies. You have everything scheduled. So implementing the intervention begins on the first day of the program. And it involves all the things like administrating the program. How are you going to register people? How are you going to recruit people once they're signed up? Is there a fee associated? How are you going to collect the fee? Where are you going to deposit the fee? Have we scheduled appropriate rooms that have adequate lighting, temperature control, space? If we need to have a marketing campaign happening during the implementation, right? Have we secured those contracts? Have we identified those channels? So there's a lot that goes into implementation that's not really kind of on display looking at a simple model like this. And then finally, it ends with evaluating the results. I may have mentioned this before, but a lot of programs, planning models will list evaluation at the end of the model, and that has a lot to do with what's called summative evaluation as opposed to formative evaluation. So formative evaluation, you're doing evaluation prior to or during the implementation, and then summative evaluation really focuses on your either your long-term objectives or your ultimate goal. So summative evaluation, you can't really evaluate whether or not you met your goal until the program ends. So I can see why they would put it there. But just keep in mind that once you set up your goals and objectives in a measurable format, you've kind of started your evaluation plan at that point, because now you need to start thinking about, if I have a measurable objective, how am I going to measure that? Right? So you need to think about, okay, well, what data do I need in order to evaluate this objective? How am I going to collect that data? And then how am I going to analyze that data in a way, in a meaningful way, that allows me to assess whether or not that objective was met, and to what degree that objective was met or wasn't met. Okay, so basically this is just the text format of the model. We've gone through these, assessing needs. We want to make sure that we're addressing real needs. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to demonstrate any type of success if the problem that you're addressing really isn't a significant problem in the target population. Next, setting your goals and objectives. Again, this kind of lays out the framework for our program design. The program has to be designed around achieving those objectives and goals. So at that point, then you develop your intervention once you have your collection of goals and objectives. Then a lot of effort needs to go into the implementation of the intervention. There's a lot of things that can happen that can be difficult to plan for, right? Things that are unexpected. Maybe you have a space reserved over in the recreation center, and on the day that you're scheduled to deliver one of your program components, there was flooding and that room is closed off and for rehabilitation. Okay, well, what are you going to do at this point, and how are you going to overcome this without disrupting the rest of your plan, according to time and schedules? And then finally, your evaluation of results. Remember, this is something that we've considered all along. Down here, I mentioned formative and summative evaluation. Formative evaluation, quality of the program, because you're assessing objectives as the program is being implemented. You can kind of get a sense for, is this program following kind of the trajectory that I thought it would when I was working up this plan. And then summative evaluation, again, effectiveness of the program in terms of meeting objectives and ultimately your goal. So pre-planning, right? These are things that you need to start doing before you actually jump all into your data collection and that sort of thing. It's not an explicit part of the GMPP, but it's something that is implied with every program, right? You got to do some preliminary work to really get a sense or get a handle on the situation. Okay, so we're going to sample a few different program planning models, and there are many more. But as we go through these, I want you to keep the GMPP in the back of your mind, and that generalized framework, and see where these other program planning models either align or diverge away from the GMPP. And you start thinking about these things, these models critically. Your own assessment, your own opinion. Do you think that each model is doing enough to put you in a situation where you're most likely to succeed or have a successful program? And at the end, like I mentioned, the GMPP usually isn't incorporated in practice. It's more of a teaching tool, but it's more of to give you a general sense of kind of how comprehensive your planning approach needs to be to create a worthwhile health promotion program plan. One other thing, right in the middle it says, although these models share common elements, they often label and describe these elements differently. And that's something that you want to keep in mind. A lot of times when people develop a quote unique model, they want to maintain that uniqueness through the labels that they use for each of the components of the particular model. And this is something we commonly see, even in when we're discussing theories of health behavior, why people do the things that they do. The model is just trying to explain the mechanism and break it down into parts. So the mechanism we're talking about here is the mechanism utilized to create a program, right? Think of this as a machine. And what the models do is basically break the machine down into individual parts so that, one, you can conceptualize this mechanism in a way that's easily understandable, and two, just to make sure that you're feeding the machine all the information and tasks that are required in order to produce a health promotion program. As we go through, you're going to see different levels of specificity and attention to certain areas along the program planning process. But you just want to kind of keep in mind that it is a process that, as far as plan development, and you just want to let the process work. All right, so if you choose a model, make sure you're addressing all the components of that model by identifying a single model to use during program planning. You can distribute that to your design team, so everybody's kind of on the same page. Everybody understands kind of what we're doing and how we're going about doing that. With that model, you can adhere to all the building blocks or the components. Now this part down here, it says it's linear yet fluid. Let's go back to the general model for program planning. Because we're working in a two-dimensional space, the graphical representation of the model, it's laid out from left to right or from top to bottom in the case of this PowerPoint. And that's a linear progression. But like I mentioned with evaluation, you're thinking about that all throughout the steps in the GMPP. You may get to a point where you need to loop back and revisit some of the objectives, revise the objectives. Remember, they're measurable. Maybe you decrease the magnitude of change that you're seeking as a way to conserve resources later on. So that's the fluid part, is that just because you've moved from one step to another doesn't mean that you can't go back and revisit those components. And it aligns with the grant writing process. Well, it depends on the grant that you're going for, but usually a grant proposal has you address specific items within that RFP, and the programming model may allow you to kind of separate out information and steps and strategies that you could apply to the grant application itself. Okay, so at the end of this lecture, right, you still may be left with the question, okay, well, which model's best? Which model should I use? And that's a difficult question to answer, simply because you may be very comfortable and familiar with a particular model, and you utilize it every time you enter a situation where you're asked to develop a health promotion program. But there may be some uniqueness about a particular situation that maybe inhibits your ability to use that particular model. So you may have to adjust and select a different model that you're able to fulfill based on the particulars of that situation. But there's other factors that contribute to model selection. So if we look at the first one, preferences of stakeholders, right? So these are individuals that have some type of vested interest in what you're doing, certainly with the priority population, and they come from diverse backgrounds. And some of those backgrounds may include previous experience with program development, and they may have settled on a particular model that they really value, and they would like you or whoever is awarded the project to follow that particular model. That's a situation you're going to have to evaluate. If you are really opposed to that preferred model, how's that going to impact your relationship with the stakeholders, especially if they're decision makers, if they hold the purse strings to resources, right? It could impede your ability to be successful. You want to think about that. Time and funding. There's going to be some complex program planning models that may require you to go out and collect information. Well, when you do that, it's going to consume resources, it's going to consume time. Is the model so complex that it's just not feasible for you to utilize it in its full capacity? Well, if you're not fulfilling the model, then the logic is, well, you're not going to be successful, because the model kind of predicates that, hey, you're going to follow all these components. If you do those, that's what's going to give you the best shot. So again, you just need to make everything relative to what you're working with. Resources for data collection and analysis, I just mentioned that. Data collection is one area that most people underappreciate. I see this all the time when students come to me with thesis project ideas, and the idea and the research question are really intriguing, but when we start to discuss, okay, well, what data do you need in order to answer that research question, right? There's some challenges there, identifying the right appropriate variables and that sort of thing. But then I ask them, okay, well, how are you going to collect that data? That's a whole nother can of worms. So imagine if you're doing a survey. Are you going to go out into public and just approach people to ask them to fill out the survey? Well, during times like these, you're probably not going to get a lot of participation, and even without a pandemic going on, participation rates in that particular modality can be negatively impacted by a lot of factors. Okay, are you going to have an online survey, right? Okay, well, how are you going to recruit people to take the survey? Qualtrics is a online company, an analysis company that facilitates online data collection. I've used them in the past. However, depending on the scope of your data collection needs, how many participants or subjects do you need to complete your survey, there could be a dollar cost associated with that. Okay, so you need to factor that in. Then your analyses. Remember, selecting the appropriate parametric or non-parametric statistics. Did you set up your data collection appropriately to collect the type of data that you need? One thing I want to pause here and kind of talk about is when you're trying to get information from your priority population, right, in the form of a survey. So you can ask similar questions in different ways, and it absolutely impacts the type of data that you'll collect. Remember, I told you non-numerical data is non-parametric, numerical data is parametric. Parametric is a much more robust statistical analysis. So it makes sense to collect parametric response data so that you have those statistical analyses at your disposal. Now you can convert parametric data into non-parametric data, but you cannot convert non-parametric data into parametric data. So let me give you an example. So say we're interested in physical activity in our sample group. Now, a question or item on the survey that would collect non-parametric data would be if you ask the question, are you physically active? Yes or no. Right? So that creates two groups, those that are physically active, those that aren't. Again, we can use frequencies. We count the number of people that answered yes, number of people that answered no, and compare the two. Okay, but you need to think about, okay, well, what do those results infer? What do those results allow us to say about the population in terms of that particular item? It's it's very on at face value. It just tells you who self-identifies as being physically active and who doesn't. Now, if we reworded the question and we ask them in a typical week, how many days are you physically active for 30 minutes or more? And then the responses, they can do 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, now we have a better sense of not only who's physically active, but what's the magnitude of the physical activity. Now we can convert that data, that parametric data, into non-parametric, right? Right. If we have the question, during a typical week, how many days are you physically active, 30 minutes or more? Anybody that responds with a 0, right, that would be the same as saying no, I'm not physically active. Anyone that has 1 or more, right, that'd be the same as individual saying yes, I am physically active. So my advice is to collect the higher level data, the parametric data. If the need arises to you have non-parametric, you can convert backwards. Number 4, involvement of partners, right? Is it going to be beneficial to you to bring in partners, right? Whether it's expertise, resources, but just be aware that partnerships may introduce some level of expectation on behalf of the partners. Maybe they have an agenda that doesn't exactly align with what you're doing, and they may want to have you come into alignment with their agenda in exchange for whatever resources they're sharing. Preferences of a funding agency, whether you're going through something like National Institutes of Health grant, a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant, an internal, maybe a technology grant like at FAU. Maybe they state, okay, well, in order to apply for this grant, you need to utilize a particular model. So again, the selection of models ultimately, well, I said initially begins with what your preference is, what you're comfortable with, but you also need to be open-minded about, well, some of these partnerships and agreements that I get into may stipulate a particular model that I use. Okay, so when you're working with partners and stakeholders, you need to identify personnel or you within yourself. You need to recognize who's more of a people person, who's more of a kind of negotiator in meetings to kind of facilitate this relationship between program planners and wants and needs of the stakeholders. And there's an art to that. Some people are better at representing the program mission and negotiating than others, right? You want to make sure you have the best people in the best situations. Okay, so the 3 F's of program planning, you need to think, all right, fluidity. Are the steps sequential? Are they happening, at the same time? What's your approach to fulfilling the program model? Flexibility, right? a lot of times the specificity of what you need to do within each model isn't really emphasized, and that's a nod to maintaining flexibility, being able to change and adapt to the situation, and while still adhering to the basic principles of the planning model. And then, and absolutely, you need to consider functionality, right? You know, does this model that I've selected, right, if I fulfill that model, does it give me the best chance at being successful, right? That always has to be a major consideration when you're selecting these things. Why select a model that you feel is inadequate, because the result's probably going to be inadequate. Not necessarily saying that that's the case all the time, but that's at least something you should be considering. Do you really feel this model is going to develop a product that has legs and can be successful? Okay, other things to consider: population-based approach, meaning that the wants and needs of your priority population are going to feed into the program model. Perhaps you're looking at an ecological framework. Look up the socio-ecological model. You just Google it, pull up an image, and basically what the socio-ecological model, kind of the concept behind it. Think about a person making a health behavior decision. Okay, so it begins with the intrapersonal level, which is the individual themselves. So their attitudes, beliefs, their knowledge, skill set, everything that pertains to that particular behavior goes into their ultimate decision. Right? So that's easy to understand. But the sociological model says, well, there's also other things that influence that decision beyond strictly what is unique to the individual. So the next sphere of influence in that decision making process goes to the interpersonal level. That's where friends and family basically. So if you're sitting there thinking about you want to start doing a Zumba class, right? So you're going through, what do I know about Zumba? It sounds like it's fun. There's health benefits, and then you start thinking about, okay, what would my friends think if I told them, hey, I'm going to start a Zumba class, right? Would they laugh? Would they think I was being silly, or would they be supportive, right? That is going to exert some level of influence on that decision. And then the rest of the socio-ecological model is just kind of expands out. It's like if you threw a pebble in a pond, right? You're going to have these concentric waves go out. That's kind of represents how the model works. So the next sphere of influence, talking about the organizations we belong to, communities that we live in, we work in, policies and regulations that kind of dictate our decisions or influence our decisions. So, you need to kind of decide what your approach is going to be. Okay, some of the more common models: evidence-based planning framework for public health, map it, precede, proceed, healthy communities, and SMART. Those would be the ones that we'll discuss in lecture, but there are many other program models out there that you can choose from. And just, as we go through this small sample we'll go through today, just keep in mind that there are a lot of similarities, and a lot of them were developed or revisions of developed models. Again, they're trying to enhance the model's ability to be successful. So you really can't choose incorrectly, but you may choose models that are perform better than others in different situations. Okay, so this first model, the evidence-based planning framework for public health. So as we go through the phase one, kind of, again, keep the general model for program planning in the back of your head. So with community assessment, okay, is just that. we want to understand not only our priority population, but the whole community context that kind of influences their decisions, right? That whole socio-ecological model approach. Working with a population to become more physically active, you're going to have different challenges depending on what the community context that you'll be operating in. So if you're working with a group where the community context is that there aren't sidewalks, there aren't crosswalks, it's there aren't a lot of outdoor spaces, there aren't a lot of resources or access to resources available in that community to facilitate a physically active lifestyle, compared to another situation where the people live in a community where that there's walking groups, there's lit sidewalks, there's parks, there's the beach, there's all sorts of things. So in this phase one, you want to do that. You want to understand the situation that you're dealing with, because there are details about that situation that could influence or impact your ability to deliver your program. Phase two, quantifying the issue. So using descriptive epidemiology, and I don't know if we've talked about it up in this point or what your understanding is of this term epidemiology, but basically epidemiology is the study of diseases, and the way that we facilitate the study of diseases is by looking at data, and we want that data to tell us a story about that particular condition we're interested in. So how can we tell the story of what's going on in this population that we're working with? Well, descriptive epidemiology basically it's frequencies, it's magnitude, it's describing. So say we're interested in type 2 diabetes, so we would go back, look at data collected on disease status, and we could describe the distribution of diabetes in the population, right? Do more men or women have it? Are there racial differences or age differences, socioeconomic differences? So that's the descriptive part. But really, the more descriptive we are, the better understanding we have of the population that we're working with, and that better understanding allows us to do some little bit of pre-planning to identify, okay, well, when working with these particular groups with these characteristics, we tend to see these challenges come up. So how are we going to deal with those challenges if in fact that's what we run into? And at the very end of this phase two, quantifying the issue bulleted statement, it says other secondary data sets. At this point, I just want to make a distinction between primary and secondary data sets. So primary data are data that you collect yourself, right? You determine what data that you are interested in, what type of data you need to collect, how you're going to collect it, who you're going to sample, right? So a lot of control. Secondary data sets are data that have already been collected and you're just accessing the data. Now, right off the bat, you can see that there's a difference in effort required to collect primary versus secondary. Secondary, you just need permission and whatever technology is used to access that data. For example, you can go to CDC's website. You can navigate around and you can find data sets based on national surveys that are readily available. The format that the data is presented in may be specific to a particular piece of software. Well, if you have that software, then you can have access to the data. Other secondary data sets, right, are the result of someone's primary data collection efforts, and they may not be willing to share, right, or maybe they are, right, but essentially they serve as a gatekeeper between you and the data set. It may be simple as that, just asking for permission, or it may be some type of contractual obligation that you need to enter into in order to gain access to it. But just keep in mind the difference between primary and secondary. Primary, again, you have a lot more control, but it is going to consume more resources. Okay, phase three, developing a concise statement of the issue. Again, the sooner you identify the problem that you're going to be focusing on, the sooner you can begin the next steps, kind of strategizing how you're going to address that problem. But um, but at some point, you're going to have a problem statement, right? That you know absolutely identifies your target. Phase four, determining what is known using scientific literature. All right, so here's where the evidence-based solutions development comes into play. So you're going to do a lit review. Basically, you're going to use something like, I use Google Scholar. It's just a lot easier than some of the other specific databases. But initially, what I'll do is start thinking about, okay, what keywords are associated with the community and the problem that I'm focusing on. So right now I have a student that is looking at physical activity in breast cancer survivors um, during their treatments. So think about, well, what keywords would you need to return articles that address those issues, right? So you're looking at physical activity, certainly breast cancer survivor. Maybe you want to enter in chemotherapy or some of the other treatments. Maybe after that search you start going through the return literature, and you're saying, well, I'm not really seeing a lot with breast cancer survivors. So maybe you go back, you amend your search terms, you remove breast and just look at cancer and physical activity, chemo, right? That returns some other things, and you start to look through those articles and see, just get a sense, are they running into the same priority issue that I've identified? What would have been their strategies to overcome? What were their outcomes? Those sorts of things. So at this point, you're really trying to inform yourself about the situation you're dealing with. Okay, phase five, developing and prioritizing program and policy options. So here you're starting to address what you need to do within your program, or how you're going to meet your objectives and goals. Phase six, developing an action plan and implementing. Okay, straightforward. You take your developed goals and objectives, your strategies to meet those goals and objectives, and you start thinking about, well, how am I going to kind of put the plan into play? And again, phase seven, evaluating the program or policy. Again, it shows up at the end, but this is something that you should be thinking about all along. But at some point, you need to be able to demonstrate some program movement or success. In you're going to have to do that, so you should be planning up front how you're going to evaluate, so that when you get to phase seven, right, everything's in place, and you have that report ready. Okay, another program model, our program planning model, is mobilizing for action through planning and partnership. Right, that's where the map comes from. Okay, developed by the National Association of County and City Health Officials. I love this one. It's NACCHO. Okay, so NACCHO basically, think about local health departments and directors of local health departments. They all kind of get together and collaborate on kind of a unified approach to basically the shared mission that they have. Um, it makes for a much easier and much more efficient way to implement programs if over a large area you have all the sub components, these health departments all working together, and you don't have people out there doing things on their own in different ways. We can be much more effective at a larger scale if the individuals in these roles do collaborate and share information. Okay, so just like any other program planning model, there's going to be steps or phases. So in this one, in phase one, it's really kind of a feasibility study, right? You're pulling together groups and individuals that you feel give your program the best shot at being successful, and you want to start that off early, kind of in this pre-planning stage. Okay, two, visioning. So visioning is basically, does everyone share the same vision as to what we're doing and where we need to be? When you start having differences in visioning, that's going to be problematic, because people are going to want their vision to be realized, and if it's different than what other people envision, okay, there's going to be some conflict there. Okay, phase three, the four MAP assessments. Okay, so we look through here. So community opinion, right? So again, here's your needs assessment, basically getting a sense for how the community, what they prioritize. Health department capabilities. Again, this is resources, right? What, we can't enter into a plan where the health department is inadequately funded, staffed, whatever it is. The plan's doomed right at that point. Okay, health status. So we want to look at, okay, what are the health issues that currently exist, and then forces of change. Okay, what's going on? What's unique about the situation? How do we facilitate change? What's going to be the mechanisms? Okay, phase four, identify strategic issues. Well, you may have a big list of things that need to be done in this particular situation, but you're most likely not going to be able to address all of those things. So, prioritize what things have the most bang for the buck. What do you want to focus on? So you need to come up with a way to prioritize. Okay, phase five, based on those priorities, let's look at goals and figure out strategies how we're going to meet those goals. Phase six, the action cycle. So implementation. Again, think about these models and the similarities that they have. So whenever you develop a plan, you're always going to have to think about, how am I going to implement it. Always remember, implementation is a big deal. There's things that you just can't plan for, that occur once implementation starts. And then the evaluation phases, right? Collecting your data, analyzing your data, interpreting your data in a timely manner that makes those analyses have some type of utility. And then graphical representation of the phases. Okay, map it, the goal. So this was a planning guide used to develop Healthy People 2020 at the state or local level. So you take the Healthy People 2020. It has its objectives, and now we're looking at, okay, well, what do we need to do in order to contribute to meeting that particular objective. Okay, 5 phases of map it, and nearly identical to the generalized model, because the generalized model is more of a teaching tool. As such, it's a pretty comprehensive, while being a generalized model as possible. So if we go through mobilize, right? What are we mobilizing? Key individuals and organizations, pulling them together into a collaborative effort, a coalition that can address the problems that exist in the community. Okay, 2, assess, right? Needs assessment. We've talked about how important that is. Here's where it appears in this model. Plan. Well, that's what we're doing. We're planning or designing our health motion program. So here we're going to look at goals, right? We need to know what our final destination is, objectives, measures. Here we look at baselines and targets. So program success is defined by movement or change within the objectives. So when you say that, the example I keep using is by 2021, students on the campus of FAU will increase their physical activity levels by 50%. 50% improvement over what? Right, so that'd be your baseline, your 50% improvement. That's your target. So you're again, it's advocating for development of measurable objectives. Okay, implement, again, implementation, you're always going to have to consider that. Track, well, it's just another way that they're saying evaluation. So again, a lot of similarities. Okay, the next model, precede proceed. This is my personal preference. This particular model was developed to assist with health promotion program planning. It's probably one of the more prolific models in use out there. I like it because of the way it's laid out. I prefer to use that kind of as a teaching model, because it does have clearly defined steps or phases within the precede proceed model. So in any situation, that's going to be my go-to. But also keep in mind what I said earlier, you may have to adapt or change model selection based on a number of different factors. Okay, so precede was the initial model. As you can read here, developed in the early 70s. And after that was kind of put into play for a while, people that were utilizing the precede model said, it's good how it sits, but there's still other aspects of health motion programming that the model really doesn't address. So in the 80s, right, proceed, all right, that second portion of the model was developed and then added. And basically what it added was implementation and then your evaluation component. So early on it was good at putting together the program plan, but as far as moving from plan to action, there were some gaps. So now we use the combined form of the model, precede, proceed. Okay, so here's how the model's laid out. And it isn't laid out this way to make it fit onto a single slide. It's meant to align phase 1 with phase 8. So basically, and I'll go through each of these phases, but I want to kind of talk to you about what I mean. So phase 1, social assessment, really the main purpose of phase 1 is that you're identifying the population priorities in terms of their quality of life, right? What do they enjoy in life? And quality of life is a variable that's different depending on who you talk to, what groups you talk to. But at that point, the goal of the program is going to be improving the current situation. Okay, if we go all the way around, right, and it steps us through developing, the model to improve the situation. But with phase 8, outcome evaluation, that's your summative evaluation point. But basically, the outcome is, did we improve the situation, right? So we end where we began, and that's why it's laid out like that. But I just want to point it out. All right, so 8 phases, and it's breaking down what you need to do to plan, design, and implement, and of course evaluate a health motion program. So you begin with your social assessment. Here's where we focus on the target population. Phase 2, your epidemiological assessment. Okay, that's going to be your needs assessment, or the second part of your needs assessment in terms of quantifying the health issue. Okay, phase 3, your education and ecological assessment. And I'll go through these, but for kind of in a nutshell, in phase 2, we're identifying health, behavior, and environmental factors that contribute to the problem. Phase 3, we're looking at, well, how did these things come about? Why do people engage in certain behaviors? why are certain health issues prevalent? So we're kind of analyzing that. Phase four. Now, anytime you implement a program, it's going to take place in some context, some situation. And depending on that situation, there may be policies that pertain to the situation and now pertain to you simply because you're working in that organization. For example, if we wanted to develop a program and implement it on the campus of FAU, well, we would need to understand, okay, what policies are in place at FAU that could potentially impact our ability to implement this program. Right now with the pandemic, right, there's limited space utilization available. The number of people that you can have in one space is going to be limited. Utilizing mask and social distancing, that's going to be something that you're going to have to contend with, and you're going to have to meet the policies of FAU in order for FAU to continue to allow you to do that. So in phase four, we kind of spend some time looking at those. Okay, phase five, implementation. Okay, we kind of develop an understanding of that. Now, phase six, seven, and eight they're all evaluation, but they break it up into specific components. Now, process and impact evaluation, that's going to be formative evaluation. Your outcome evaluation, that's going to be summative. With process evaluation, basically you're evaluating your program fidelity. All right, program fidelity is simply how well you're sticking to your plan. Okay, so process evaluation really doesn't get involved in the actual behavioral changes or knowledge changes or skill set changes. No, it basically says that, okay, well, the plan says you're going to offer this education sessions on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. But we're going to go back and look and see, did we in fact deliver an education session on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday? So process evaluation. So this is helpful in the event that your program is not as successful as you thought it was going to be, and maybe you look back to process evaluation and say, well, gosh, we didn't really even follow the plan that we worked up. So any expectations of success are out the window once you deviate from your plan. Phase six helps you determine deviation. Phase seven, impact evaluation. So impact evaluation looks at your measurable objectives. Are you meeting those measurable objectives as the program is being implemented? And outcome evaluation basically focuses on, did you meet your goal or goals that you established early on? So let's step through each of the phases. So with phase one, the social assessment. So really, this is your opportunity to develop some type of relationship with your target population. And the way that you do this is you're involving them in kind of the initial needs assessment. You're asking them questions like, what do you think the issues are in this community? What health issues do you see as being problematic or needing to be addressed? And really, you're getting their perspective of the situation. And I think it's very important that we recognize that, okay, we're health promotion people. They may not be, in a health field or have health training or anything like that. So we may be looking at the same situation, but it's through a different lens. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's life. We enter into a lot of situations where we don't share the same view as others. But what we're trying to do is just appreciate their perspective, learn what their perspective is, and it's helpful kind of for us to be able to see, okay, this is how the target population is assessing the situation. If they're missing the main points, well, we have an opportunity to kind of maybe do some health education, say, well, maybe you didn't notice this, but this condition is really prevalent in this community compared to the surrounding communities, right? It may be something like that, or it may be something that comes to light that you weren't aware of. So maybe target population said, you know what, somebody needs to clean up these parks, right? These playgrounds are just, they're disgusting. There's, insects and rodents, and I'm not, I wouldn't take my child there. And if we're trying to do something with, increasing physical activity in children, and we say, okay, well, we're looking at a map, they have a number of parks available to them. All right, we'll just encourage them to use the parks. If you didn't take the time to sit down with the target population and learn that, hey, okay, yeah, parks are there, but they're unusable, right? That may be beneficial to us, right? And it's not always going to align that way, but one, we're getting a sense for what the problems are as through the eyes of the target population. But another thing that seems to emerge out of this is when you're asked a question about your ideas on coming up with a solution that's ultimately going to help you, well, then you start to feel like you're part of the process, right? You start to form ownership of the project, right? So once you establish ownership, well, you want to kind of see it through, and you want it to be successful. So it may motivate you more to be part of the program, to do all the things the program is asking you, because you want to see the benefit. Now, when you're getting perspective from the general population, right? It may not be in a format that, as a health educator or health promotion specialist, that you're used to dealing with. So, you may see quality of life indicators as reported from your target population, right? Think about that. Think about what quality of life means to you, and think about how your surroundings, your community, influences kind of your assessment of quality of life, right? If you live in an area where you feel comfortable at night, you're out walking the dog at night, you're not in fear for your safety, right? And that's going to result in a higher quality of life. But then think about, well, what if there's a crime spree that's going on? People breaking into homes, into cars in your neighborhood, people are getting robbed, right? Just think about how that would impact your quality of life, right? That you're going to be consumed with that. Well, I hope they catch these individuals. I hope I don't, run into a situation where I have to deal with that. So, learning these things from your target population, again, is just going to give you a better sense of who you're working with, the context of the situation you're working with. So you can gain a lot from the social assessment, but just think about there's a lot that needs to go into creating opportunities for the target population to be able to share these views with you. All right, so at the end of phase one, basically we identified the priority issue from the population standpoint, and we're going to incorporate that into our goal. Remember, we'll just keep it generic and say the goal is to improve the situation. So how are we going to do that? Okay, so in phase two, now we put our health promotion hats back on, and now we're looking at kind of the traditional needs assessment. What are the health issues that are plaguing this community, right? Because that's what our expertise is going to be. That's what our purpose is to address those health issues. So phase two, the epidemiological assessment, that's where we start to do that. So again, are we going to use primary, secondary data? We may use some secondary data as a screening. One thing I'll say about secondary data is that oftentimes you're given kind of an average, right? So if you're comparing Palm Beach County with Broward County, you may get an average number of people impacted by the disease, or you may get the total number of people impacted by the condition. And you can say, okay, well, Palm Beach County has a higher number of cases than Broward County. Okay, that's good to know. But that doesn't really help you with, okay, well, what do I need to do in order to lower the number of cases in Palm Beach County? Right? you're going to need more specified data, okay, or more descriptive data. And if that database that you're accessing doesn't have that, well, then you're kind of stuck, right? The data is very doesn't have much utility at that point. So need to always think about the quality and utility of the data that you're using. But anyway, so uh, throughout this needs assessment, now we're looking at the health issues. Okay, again, we got to prioritize them. I'm not going to be able to address all of them. So other things that are occurring is we're also looking at behaviors, right? So if we have a health issue and just say, in this particular context, we're looking at sexually transmitted infections. Well, if we want to change the number of sexually transmitted infections that are detected each quarter, year, whatever, we need to think about, okay, well, what are the behaviors associated with someone having a positive STI? And we can go through things like, of course, there's unprotected sex. Maybe promiscuity, you had multiple partners. You have multiple partners. There's multiple opportunities for, even if you're using barrier protection for the barrier to fail or whatever. But you may want to also consider, well, what about substance abuse, right? Like excessive alcohol consumption that leads you to kind of make questionable decisions and may result in you making a decision that ends up you contract an STI. So you start thinking about all the behaviors that we want to look at and consider in terms of program change. Now down here at the bottom there it talks about risk factors determined can be prioritized with a 2x2 matrix. We call this the priority matrix, and basically it's two questions, right? You're thinking about, like, if we have a list of health issues: diabetes, cardiovascular disease, STIs, right? That's what the needs assessment told us. These are the issues that exist in this population, and we want to prioritize what our program is going to focus on. We can't address all of them. We just want to focus on the high priority ones. Well, this 2x2 matrix, this priority matrix, you just go through it's two questions applied to each determinant, and that establishes its priority. The first one is how important would changing the health status be to overall quality of life or improving the situation? Okay, it's either more important or less important, right? There's some line of relativity you're going to have to establish as far as the difference between more and less, but so basically you answer that question. The next question you ask is related to changeability, right? What's the feasibility that your program can actually change the health status, right? The answer response can be more changeable, less changeable. Again, that line of relativity is something you're going to establish. And basically anything that has more important, more changeable, that's going to be in quadrant one. And with a 2x2 matrix, it's going to have 4 quadrants. Each quadrant represents basically what you do with items that show up in that quadrant. So what I'm going to do is I have a little mini lecture on priority matrix I've used in another class. I'm going to upload it to the module so that you can review that and kind of have a better sense of what this priority matrix is and how to prioritize from a list of options. Phase 3, the educational ecological assessment. So we identify those health issues in phase 2, and also what you identify are the behaviors related to each of the health issues, and to some extent you also consider the environmental factors that contribute to either facilitating the behaviors or are associated with the health outcome, like things like access to health care, right? That may impact the health status as it exists in the community. We identify behaviors. If we change them, then we would expect to see a change in the health status. So you've identified those. Now, we want in phase three, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand, well, how do those behaviors and environmental factors come about, right? If we want to change a behavior, we have to understand why a person made that behavioral decision in the first place, because if we want to undo it or change it, then we have to touch on those specific quote whys, WHYS, what went into that person's decision. Now, three types of factors associated with phase three. Predisposing factors. Now, these are characteristics that a person brings to the situation prior to any exposure to our health programming efforts. Okay, so we have here antecedent, right? So they occur before uh, anything. These are basically the characteristic profile of the population you're working with. So example, on the very first day that you meet with someone and you want to talk about a health issue, well, they're going to enter that situation already having some body of knowledge. Now, it may be a very small body of knowledge, or it may be a very extensive body of knowledge, but that's a characteristic they bring to them. And so we can extend this to attitudes, beliefs, perceptions. Everybody can be in a same situation but perceive it differently, right? We want to get a sense of that. And then values. One thing I want to pause here and say something about values. Values are what we want to consider to be values, are things that are really intertwined with that person's self identity. We have an election that's coming up, and there's a lot of divisiveness in the candidates, surrounding the candidates in the election. And you can really apply this to any election. But the point I'm trying to make is that, a person's position on their politics is often closely, tied into their values. So think about how difficult it would be to get someone that is firmly rooted in, their political ideologies. Think about what it would take to get that person to change their mind, and switch to the other side. Right? It's not very realistic. So you may want to identify a person's value set, but don't set out to change their values. Most people will see that as a personal attack, and then you've lost them from the program. And they're probably going to be other bad mouthing your program. So don't try to change a person's value. Now, increasing a person's knowledge, changing a person's attitude through changing their collection of beliefs, right? That's certainly advisable. Changing their perception. You want to change these things to align with what you want to do. Assessing predisposing factors also gives you a sense of what your program needs to provide. So if you are assessing knowledge and you find that, okay, well, many of the potential participants don't have an adequate level of knowledge about what we're trying to do, well, you know that your program needs to provide that. So that takes me into enabling factors. Okay, what does your program have to do in order to enable the behavior change? Okay, removing barriers to the behavior change. Okay, so maybe we're doing a smoking cessation program on campus, but currently campus, there are designated smoking areas. Well, that may facilitate the behavior in an opposite direction that we're trying to change. So by removing designated areas, right now you just make it more of a challenge for the person to easily slip into an opportunity to take a cigarette break when they're in fact trying to quit. Skills, again, your education, what do you need to provide? Access and availability. Make sure you know the difference between the two. So availability just means that, or say you need to distribute a product. Let's go with we're on campus, so condoms, right? You're trying to advocate for safer sex, right, through barrier protection. right? So you order boxes and boxes of condoms to distribute on campus, right? So that means they're available. But does your target population actually have access? And certainly, you want to think about things like physical access. Where are you going to place these things so that people can in fact get them. But you need to think about the kind of the social context surrounding access to condoms, right? Do you want to say, you wouldn't want to have your program set up where your distribution arm for condoms is through academic advisors. So students, if you want condoms, make an appointment with your academic advisor, right? And they'll give you some. Access really isn't going to be something that's readily available in that situation, right? Some people may feel shy, embarrassed, or maybe such a hassle go through registering for or setting an appointment and that sort of thing. So you want to think about those things. Rules and laws. Again, having a tobacco-free campus policy in place certainly enables the smoking cessation behavior that we're after. And then reinforcing factors. Basically, reinforcing factors are just how are you going to maintain motivation within the target population throughout the program to maintain this behavior change, right? How are you going to encourage people to maintain this behavior change? So really, there's a lot that goes on within each phase of pre-seed, proceed, but like I said, it gives you one of the more comprehensive views at what it takes to develop and plan for a program. Okay, phase 4. Again, I mentioned this earlier. We're trying to learn the rules of the situation or the environment that we're delivering and implementing this program. Does the organization have policies in place that impact what we do and how we do it? Well, here's where you want to figure that out, or you're going to evaluate that. In addition, you're also going to look at how your program is going to be administered internally. Right? Who's doing what? What's your budget? What what are the costs that you're going to have to lay out? Right? Does everything align? That sort of thing. Okay, phase 5, implementation. One of the shorter slides as far as content, but in reality, a lot goes into the implementation phase as far as planning. You're looking at your what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, as far as a timeline, who's going to do what. So there's a lot that goes into actually administering the program. That goes on behind the scenes that most people don't see, but it's absolutely critically important that you address everything that you need to to have a successful implementation. All right, so then your final evaluation phases, and we'll talk about these later on in the semester a little bit more. But process evaluation, just make sure you know the difference between these 3 types. So process evaluation, right, has nothing to do with the content of the program. It doesn't care if it's a diabetes program, a smoking cessation program, a prenatal care program. It doesn't care. All it's focusing on is that term I used earlier, program fidelity. Right? You've designed a plan. You're implementing the plan. Does your implementation follow the plan exactly? Process evaluation detects any deviation. Okay, that's what we're interested in there. Impact evaluation, right, really focuses on those measurable objectives that we've developed and running our analyses and evaluating whether or not we've met those objectives and to what extent. And then outcome evaluation, right? These are your long-term objectives and ultimately your goal. Okay. Now at the bottom here, this is part the publisher kind of put through. Not all phases are necessary. Their use depends on the requirements of the program. I'm not in agreement with any of that. I say go into the situation you know, with the idea that I am going to address phase 6, 7, and 8, um, and do everything you can to evaluate on these levels. I just, again, maybe I'm in the wrong, but I don't have, my opinion is that um, you don't really need to adhere to that last bullet. Not all phases are necessary. I go in, just assuming they are necessary, and kind of ride it out. Okay, the next plan model we'll look at is intervention mapping. Okay, so if we look here, design to fill a gap in health promotion practice by translating data collected in the pre-seed phases of pre-seed proceed into an appropriate interventions. And one of the things I like about intervention mapping is it's a literal map. It's basically a logic model, and the logic model has you enter in your inputs, your outputs, outcomes, and essentially what it does is every component of your model it is represented on this logic model diagram. So it's basically a one pager that represents everything that you're doing in the program as far as your strategies, and it also shows how each step kind of contributes to the next to ultimately realize your long-term outcomes. It's very useful when you're developing a program, especially if you're kind of a graphic, you're a visual person, a visual learner. I'm a visual learner, so maybe that explains I prefer this so much. But I can, logically see how all the components fit together to ultimately move individuals through your program to a successful health status change. So, you can either start off with writing out your objectives and considering your inputs, and then use the logic model kind of as a check to make sure everything is accounted for, or you could actually start with it just to see, kind of do a rough sketch of what this program is going to look like, and then base your written program plan off of that model. But it's a tool, and it's one that I prefer because of the diagrams and things that are used. Okay, the steps. Right, so needs assessment, we know the importance of that, but it also involves some other pre-planning strategies, like putting together your planning group, doing your community assessments as far as capacity, establishing how your needs assessment ultimately leads you to your goal, and kind of identifies the steps that need to happen in between. Matrices of chain objectives. So again, these are objectives that you put together, specifying who and what will change. Whenever you do objectives, I don't care what model you use and what it calls for. Every time we develop an objective, it has to have, right, these five characteristics. It's a single sentence, right? Who the objective applies to is identified. What's being changed is identified. Okay, so we're still in alignment, but two additional things you always have to consider is how much of a change you expect to see, and by when. At what point are you going to stop and evaluate that objective? So even though it calls for just who and what will change, I just want it to be burned into your brains that when we put together an objective statement, it meets those five criteria. Okay, theory-based methods and practical applications. So kind of this addresses how you're going to meet your objectives, right? What strategies you're going to use. Theory-based methods, right? Just like there are program planning models, there's also theories to explain behavior selection, and maybe we incorporate that into our behavior change components. Practical applications, right? Moving something from a concept to an action. isn't as simple as it seems. So if one of your theoretical considerations, and say we're using the theory of planned behavior, one of the constructs of that theory is to it recognizes the significance of the individual's attitude towards the behavior, right? So the idea is that if it's a more positive attitude towards behavior, then they're more likely to intend to make a behavior change. Great. So how do we improve people's attitudes, right? That's where the practical application comes into play. Okay, program production, right? Scope and sequence. So scope is basically the breadth, or how much detail you need to go into, or to what extent you need to offer a component, or what the extent of the change that the component affects. Sequence, is there foundational material that has to occur first? Are there initial steps that must be taken before we can see the other steps? Completed program materials and protocol outlines. So you're just getting everything in place in order for your program to be implemented. Okay, number 5, adoption and implementation. So adoption is that you've recruited participants, the organization or the situation that you're developing or delivering the program has adopted this idea that yes, we're going to be offering this. And then implementation, we've gone through that several times. And then evaluation planning, again, a very familiar concept in these planning models. Okay, the next model, healthy communities. So if we look here, pay attention to who kind of adopted this particular model. So we have Canada, World Health Organization, other areas in Europe, and just think about there's different philosophies and different perspectives on community health from those regions. That there's some similarities, but there's also some differences in how we view things in the United States. Just not saying that it's a bad thing or anything like that, but I'm just saying, just be aware. So this is a community-driven approach, and really what they're striving for is to develop a sense of ownership and empowerment. So ownership is where the community kind of buys into the idea that this program is going to bring about healthy change, right? And they through the development process, they're contributing to ideas, and again, they feel like they're one of the builders. So ownership comes along with that. Empowerment is a slightly different concept. When you empower individuals, basically what you're doing is giving them some sense of control over their personal health situation. Lack of empowerment, we call that hopelessness, right? And think about true hopelessness, right? Individuals that feel like no matter what they do or no matter what they want, right? Their situation, it is what it is. They can't change it. My first time really being kind of punched in the gut with this understanding of hopelessness was working with a group of kids from the Delta region of Mississippi, right? Very low socioeconomic status region, and it was part of a type 2 diabetes prevention program. And during one of the kind of discussions with the kids that were going to be involved, uh, we kept hearing them refer to type 2 diabetes as the stumps. And I never heard that before. But then after talking with a couple of the kids, we're like, well, why do you call it the stumps? And they were so normalized to relatives, grandparents, aunts and uncles having amputations due to type 2 diabetes, that they began to kind of believe that that's just what happens to people as they get older. You lose limbs. And at that point, it kind of hit me. I was like, these kids think that's what life is. That's what's going to happen to them. They're not looking to prevent that because they just think that that's just part of life. That's hopelessness. And to change that, right? To just reaffirm to someone, hey, you do have a say in all of this, right? That could be very life changing. But this healthy community, you know, focusing on this community driven kind of approach, can be a good thing. So we look at this, the change tool, the community health assessment and group evaluation. All right, so again, there's specified tools that they give you to help conduct your needs assessment. And while it aligns with the GMPP, again, this idea of community ownership, right? That's really kind of the uniqueness that they're standing on to say, hey, look, this program model is different than others because with it we emphasize this community driven approach. Okay, it's SMART. So social marketing assessment and response tool. Now this one's going to be very different than the other models that we've discussed in this point. And the difference mainly comes through the emphasis of social marketing, right? Marketing this program to your target population in a way that they feel compelled to participate in the program. Right? It also has the other components of program development, but none of the others really emphasize the significance of your social marketing approach. Okay. Okay. So this table is in the book, and also make sure you're reading these chapters. I'm giving you kind of an overview. In some areas where you may need to read the text to develop a further understanding, or in some cases like with pre-seed proceed, I'm giving you more than the book's giving you, but still use the book to kind of follow along. But what we see here, and namely I want to draw your attention to phases 2 through 4. That's really where the deviation occurs with the SMART model as opposed to some of the other program planning models, in that we're really focusing on selling this product that we have. This product is our program, and selling it simply means that we're trying to maximize participation in the program. But with phase 1, right, we're doing your preliminary planning. So all the pre-planning things that we need to put into place. Your needs assessment as far as health issues. Okay, that's where this takes place, right? So identifying the health problems and naming in terms of behavior. Again, think about what health promotion is. We're not a therapy or a curative discipline when it comes. So our only approach to alleviating the burden of the health problem is by identifying the behaviors that result in the health problem existing. And the idea is that if we change those behaviors, then that's going to impact the prevalence rate or incident rate of the health issue. So we want to do that. And so we're associating health issues, identifying behaviors, again, similar to what we've done in other program planning models. Develop your general goals. Again, we have to figure out the destination. We start thinking about, the evaluation plan, not necessarily working out the entire evaluation plan at this point, but at least you're kind of rough sketching it out. It's kind of staying true to this idea that the evaluation plan begins early on, even though it's often represented at the end of most models. Program costs, again, just getting a sense of what resources are going to be needed, kind of a ballpark. Ballparks are not that helpful. But it's just like when you take your car in to get repaired, right? You get an estimate that may or may not be the final price you pay, but the idea is that if the price is different than the estimate, that you're not going to be shocked Okay, that's really all that it does. So just getting a general sense of what's going to be needed, you can you can start to eliminate certain project ideas because the ballpark estimation of what resources are needed far exceed what you have available. So again, we're kind of doing this in phase one in the SMART model. Okay, in phase two, right, it's called the consumer analysis, and that's what we're doing. We're looking at our target population, but through a consumer lens. Um, Again, this is a formative type of research method, and you know we're trying to identify consumer preferences. Okay, how do what do they want to see, or what do they feel the needs are? Right? Are we fulfilling those needs? In phase three, your market analysis, right? So we have a new term here called the market mix. Okay, so this is very similar to commercial marketing. So just understanding your situation is basically what the marketing mix is, but relative to the four P's, right? So the four P's are product, right? What are you trying to sell? Right? It's this health motion program, or this idea that you need to improve your health status. The place, okay, what's the context? What's the situation that this program is going to be implemented in? The price. This could be a literal a price, right? Maybe there's a registration fee, participation fee. Maybe not. Um, but there's also going to be other things that are going to be considered to be price, right? So there's going to be a time commitment, right? Time is valuable. Um, Effort, if it's a physical activity, behavior change, right. People are going to have to expend energy. Is that something they want to do? Do they have to purchase things in order to participate? Right. So if it's a physical activity class, do they already have workout clothes, or do they need to purchase that? Do they have proper shoes? If there's any technology, maybe we're using Fitbits, right? Are we going to provide the Fitbit, or do they have to buy the Fitbit? We're going to assess that. And then promotion is the fourth P, right? How are you going to market um, this whole program? Or what forms of marketing do you have available? What forms of marketing does this target population seem to respond to? But basically, you're kind of getting a sense, the lay of the land. Phase four, your channel analysis. Um, how are you reaching your target population? Um, your communication channels, these are things like you take out ads in the newspaper, or there certain social media sites that you're going to use? Is it postering in high traffic areas, etc. You need to understand how your target population consumes information, and deliver the information through that particular channel. Okay, phase five, right, developing your intervention materials. Here's where you're analyzing your data, you're figuring out how you're going to meet the objectives that you have developed. Also in here, it gives you an opportunity to pre-test and refine the program, right? We call that a pilot. Um, that's not necessary in all situations. Sometimes it's not feasible, right? Because um, implementing a pilot of your program, well, that's going to consume resources, right? It's also going to consume time. This happens. It happens before you actually implement your program, so you got to factor that into your timeline. But those are things you would consider in phase five. Phase six is your implementation. Right, it's where the rubber meets the road. Similar concept that we've discussed all along. Program fidelity is something that you want to keep in mind as you're doing this. Um, with formative evaluation, evaluating objectives as the program is being implemented, that gives you an opportunity to go and tweak the program in ways that you're maximizing how effective you are at meeting these objectives, rather than waiting until the program ends and kind of seeing it happen, but then evaluating at the end that, hey, we could have been more successful if we reacted to certain things that were occurring during program implementation. And then finally, evaluation. Again, at some point, you need to stop and evaluate your objectives, and ultimately be able to say how successful were you at meeting your goal. So again, at this point, just want to introduce you that there's multiple planning methods out there. There are subtle differences. There, in some cases, there are extreme differences, like the case with SMART and including this social marketing aspect. But essentially, they all follow that general model of program planning in terms of needs assessment, developing your program, implementing your program, evaluating your program, and some emphasize areas more than others, but the idea is that select one of these and apply it to your program plan, your approach to program planning. Again, we just want the consistency and the structure that these models provide, just to make sure that our models are based in or rooted in some type of theoretical concept that supports, hey, if you follow this framework, then your program has a higher expectation to be successful. So I'll stop the lecture here, but make sure you go back and continue reading on in the chapter, especially the last section where they walk you through an application of the general model for program planning. Again, just to kind of see how we can utilize the framework in a practical application.